just remember that in 99.9% of cases, your company's success is going to be related to the human beings who are in that organization. So leaders do have to be human-centric in their approach. Technology is a wonderful enabler, accelerator, etc. But these technologies still only work by humans and are for humans. So let's not forget that. And let's pay a lot more attention as leaders to creating human dynamics that help make our work life more rewarding and therefore make our companies more dynamic and successful.
Welcome to Sustainability Transformations podcast, where we explore bold ideas to drive positive change for people, the community, and business. And today we are so pleased we have Adam Kingl, who's going to share with us some incredible aspects around the leadership and how it's related to sustainability and how employees, leaders, and startup within the sustainability space can learn from those key aspects. So thanks, Adam, for time. We really appreciate that. What's one belief about leadership that you've completely changed your mind in the last 3 years or so, and why?
But thanks for having me. Leadership, I think, has evolved quite a bit, and it has to do with responding to our world of work. So the best leaders respond to their followers and what they need from work, careers, life, and leadership. So I think one of the biggest shifts that I've observed, particularly if people have confronted what is a career, what is work life because of COVID and lockdown, big shift is what people want from work is less material than it used to be. And look, I know that careers are about making a living, etc. However, some of the most important aspects now that I'm hearing and in my own research are non-material things. And so leaders need to be hyper aware of these aspects like work-life balance, purpose, culture, development. Notice very little of what I said there is about salary, bonus, benefits. And again, I'm not dismissive of those things, but there has been a shift in emphasis or value. And I think it also just reflects how we're evolving as a society and related to the shocks and turbulence that we've all felt over the last 5 years.
There time in career or among generations where it may have shifted from the narrative of work for a company for 20 years, get a great pension. Was there a shift during a generation or over time where that has now shifted into this multifaceted non-financial factors? I'm curious to know the trend.
The trend, I think, was actually quite a steady evolution rather than a point in time whereby sort of everything changed. And that's why I think most of us have become gradually aware of the evolution of work paradigms. I'll give you one really quick example that illustrates this steady, kind of irrevocable change, and that's related to loyalty. Because it's your example. You said, people don't necessarily join a company saying, I'm going to be here for 20, 25 years or for an entire career. One of the things that I observed, which sort of kicked off my research on different paradigms in the world of work amongst generations, I observed this. When you looked at baby boomers, generally in their career, they have or have had 2-3 employers their entire career. And then for Gen X, it's more like 6, 7, 8. For Gen Y or millennials, at the rate at which they are changing employers, it's going to be something like 16. At the rate at which Gen Z or Z are changing employers, it's going to be something like 32. So clearly you can see from the numbers I've just shared with you, with every generation, on average, the number of employers in a career is doubling. Now, you wouldn't necessarily have noticed that in, say, 1995, at the moment when lots of Gen Xs were entering the workforce. But when you look across decades, this is a dramatic shift. And it's been, as I said, sort of steady and inexorable.
From a sustainability point of view, we are hearing a lot of sustainability managers and sustainability leaders or sustainability specialists within that domain where there is a start of talking about burnout. And so the reason I share this is for the audience to realize why this is important, even though it's a general change in employment. from a sustainability specifically, there are burnouts. I have some ideas as to why those could be happening, but perhaps in our further discussion, we will unpack where those may be relevant for us, just in case anyone is wondering how is this relevant to a sustainability audience. So can you give us the 60-second arc from Yale, UCLA, LBS to human-centric leadership in turbulent times?
Yeah. So, of course, the whole notion of how we practice capitalism is evolving. If you were in a business school and were listening to a finance professor 30 years ago, they would have said, the sole purpose of a business is to create value for shareholders. And while it is still true that the purpose of business is to create value, the question of our time is for whom? And the answer is now not only shareholders. So I want to be really clear. I'm not dismissing shareholders, but the other stakeholders. And one stakeholder group that we've, I think, forgotten is employees. These people create the value. And so we have to look after them as well. To your point that people are burning out. So how could that possibly serve customers, shareholders, society, etc.? So as capitalism itself evolves, we have to think about what is the role of companies in making work life a little bit more livable. And that means injecting a little bit more humanity in our corporate culture. And that means leadership communities have to align on the behaviors they're going to practice a little bit more of and those that they're going to do a little bit less of in order to make that work life more livable and feel a greater sense of community, belonging, engaged, and therefore reducing attrition and increasing discretionary effort, which, as I said before, serves customers and shareholders.
That's great. Perhaps an extension of that, I hear a lot from very respectable leaders like Jeff Bezos, who says he's obsessed with the customers. And most business leaders, perhaps in the capitalism world, is focused on the customers. But why is it that there hasn't been a link or focus on being obsessed with the employees? Because for most parts, you have employees have to deliver the results for the customers. Why is it that the focus has gone? You have customer experience leaders within a C-suite, but where has there been the lack of focus or obsession, if I may borrow that word, obsession with the customers? Why is it not being obsessed as employees as well?
I think there's always been a strong obsession on customers. I say always, certainly over the last several decades. I think everyone understands you have to focus on customers. Otherwise, you're never going to win and compete in your marketplace. Where there's been variance and evolution is how we best serve those customers. And until recently, where we have taken our eye off the ball is, and you've mentioned this, right? Employees serve those customers. So how can those people best serve those customers if they are burned out, exhausted, completely stressed, you know, can't feed their families or whatever it might be. There was a wonderful book by the former CEO of HCL Technologies in India. I believe my memory tells me his surname is Nayar. And the title of his book says it all. Employees first, customers second. Now, he's been deliberately provocative in using that title, but he's making the point. How could you possibly optimally serve customers if you aren't looking after your people as well?
What's the single biggest misconception leaders have about Gen Z and very soon Gen Alpha at the workplace?
Yes, well, Gen Z are still kind of just entering the workforce, right? Just over the last few years. So we're still learning quite a bit. Before, when people asked me about Gen Z, I would have to base that on what teachers were saying, right, about Gen Z in terms of trying to forecast what they're going to be like when they enter the workforce. But now it's finally happening. They're here. And there's one thing we're noticing among many, but one thing is where they're consistent with Gen Ys or millennials is this emphasis on purpose, development, culture, work-life balance. That hasn't changed. What has changed is let's call it a slight rejection of sort of living one's entire life in the virtual world, right? So Gen Ys have, as digital natives, have really embraced social media, thinking about your social media profiles, who you consider your friends, whether you actually, ever see them physically, or whether, your friends are also people that you just interact with in the digital world. And what we noticed, even when Gen Z were at school, is that for example, there was greater value on books, like, for example, honest to God books made of wood pulp, where you actually carry it in your rucksack and you turn the pages, and spending more time offline, not just living in the digital world. And we sort of could have predicted that would be true, because there are two generational scholars named Strauss and Howe, and they looked at generations going back centuries, and they found something, a pattern that's almost always true, which is quite interesting. And that is that every generation partly rejects some paradigms of the previous generation. They say that doesn't really work for us. We're going to do something different, or possibly we're going to do the opposite. But what that means is that, therefore, in some cases, a given generation is more similar to the generations two above it. So in other words, if you're looking at what is Gen Z like, of course they have some similarities to Gen Y, because one of the major paradigms that they share is that they're digital natives. But in some ways, Gen Z or Z is going to be more like Gen X than Gen Y, two above. And some of that has to do with valuing human connection, physical human connection. I've mentioned, like, for the relationship to books. I think this is a good sign for theater, like live theater, not just the world of digital entertainment. We see that too in the this rise of pop-up entertainment, doing something quick, agile, but live and in person. But what this also means is that we also know is that Gen Zs are more self-reliant than Gen Ys. I don't mean that Gen Ys are somehow childish, but what a lot of managers told me is that when Gen Ys were first entering the workforce, they needed lots of support, lots of sort of mentoring. And Gen Z is more like Gen X in that they're a little bit more like, let me figure it out myself. I've got this. And that also has to do with changing parental paradigms, changing curricula in schools and pedagogies, etc. So these things are never static, and sometimes things harken back to previous times or previous generations.
If you had to design a manager's first 30 days with a Gen Z heavy team, what would you change first around feedback, autonomy, purpose? I think you've touched on how the Gen Zs are more, want to figure it out, but
Yeah, more
I'm curious to
autonomous.
know.
Yeah. Well, actually, you mentioned a Gen Z heavy team. Actually, what we also know is that multi-generational collaboration often achieves better business results than teams which are more sort of mono one or two generations. So actually, one thing I would do differently is make sure that teams represent the different generations in the workforce. And that is an area of diversity that we haven't leveraged enough in the workplace. We often don't think about that when we use the term diversity. But there are some interesting studies, for example, at Ohio State, that show that people hit creative peaks in their 20s, which probably is not a surprise to listeners, but also in their 50s. So, so that tells us too that we want to sort of create a rich mix across generations, if for no other reason for innovation and creativity. But also in corporate life, we have two interesting case studies that I found from BMW and from Pixar Animation Studios, who both had similar results from proactively, consciously engineering teams that represented all the generations that they had in their workplace. They had greater productivity, better speed, more accuracy, fewer errors, more creativity. And what's super interesting is that the oldest individuals in that team were all of a sudden asking for more development, whereas maybe they had sort of gotten quiet as they were nearing retirement, no longer asking for development opportunities. Now they're kind of re-engaged, more curious about their own development, and in some cases delaying their retirement, which is wonderful, right? In that you retain the collective wisdom of the people who have maybe been in your organization for years and have really seen where it's been and where it's going.
I'm making a generalization here, but there is a challenge of companies keeping the older generation when they are nearing the retirement. Not just keeping, but also getting the most out of their skills and talents, which helps everyone in the organization. So that's very good to
And help
see that.
society
Yeah,
as well, right? If older people, rather than retire, stay in work, or at least stay in work part-time, we know that's better in that it starts to reverse the dangerous pyramid we're getting into, where there aren't enough people in society, younger employees, or workers who are supporting a greater percent of the population that is in full retirement. We'll have a crisis, actually, in not too much time unless we can start to convince older people, if you're still healthy and well, consider somehow, in some way, remaining to some extent in the workforce.
In a way as well, I'm not sure about different countries, but a lot of companies are all fixated on full-time employment, and that may require companies to be flexible with
Yes,
perhaps part-time at the end and part-time for
completely.
those who have other commitments as well.
That's a great point. Absolutely. You said it perfectly. I think companies are still haven't changed the mindset of an employee is a full-time employee. No, employee can be part-time, or actually employee could be on a contract.
Mm.
Hiring someone, for example, to deliver a project. And of course, we know 60 to 70% of the world's work is organized in projects. So what about contracts related to projects? If you don't know what that person would do when that project finishes, then hire them to complete the project. That might suit someone at or near retirement age down to the ground to be able to work in that manner.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. So there's a lot of hiring from the HR and people team, and in some sectors like the healthcare, hospitality, there is a real battle in keeping employees, and the employee churn rate is so huge. And we've talked about some of the possible reasons. But what actually retains top young talent beyond the salary? We've touched on some of it, but perhaps we can round up on.
Yeah, so purpose is really important. Helping people understand, why do you do what you do? Why do you choose to do it here? What do you want to get out of your career? And then how can we, your employer, your manager, help you to achieve that? Most employees, the tragedy is most employees today still never have that conversation. And that's down to their leaders, not doing them a disservice. That's one. Two is work-life balance. I mentioned that before, and COVID really completely changed our concept of work-life balance. Now, the main issue that workplaces face with the phrase work-life balance is people mean different things when they say that phrase. We are not all aligned about what work-life balance actually means. And actually, some of those differences are more acute between or among generations. So for older generations, when you say work-life balance, often in older generations interpret that as number of hours worked. So if you're talking about work-life balance, in their mind, that translates as, oh, you want to work fewer hours if we're going to have a work-life balance conversation. When I ask younger generations, what do you mean when we say work-life balance? What I generally hear more often is related to where work happens. So what they're asking is flexibility of where they work. And that's quite interesting, right? Because often you see the kind of emotional triggers where someone says work-life balance, and then what you notice is the conversation gets very emotional very quickly, but that's because there's semantic discord between the parties who are trying to have the conversation, not realizing you aren't talking about the same thing. So the best piece of advice I can give my clients or when I talk to executive education participants is, if anyone comes to you and they use the phrase work-life balance, please, 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 the first thing you must do is say, great, let's have that conversation. But before we do, what do you mean in your context when you say work-life balance? Let's just make sure we're on the same page. So we're talking about the same thing. I think we can save a lot of heartache that way.
Which takes us to the next key aspect around the engagement scores or leading indicators that could tell organizations that their culture is moving in the right direction.
Well, of course, if I could be pessimistic for a minute here, we know that the biggest engagement score in the world comes from Gallup, right? Every other year, they do this massive survey of employee engagement all over the world, 100 different countries represented, every industry represented, almost every function you could think of represented. And they ask three questions. They're asking if you're engaged at work, disengaged, and actively disengaged. What's the difference between disengaged and actively disengaged? Disengaged just basically means I kind of couldn't care either way. But actively disengaged means like, I hate my job. I hate my boss. Like if I caught my boss in a dark alley one night, like I would kill them. And the numbers are startlingly bad all over the world. There's kind of no one bright spot where like this country is getting it right. Just about everywhere in the world, the numbers are terrible. I think the percent that report that they're engaged globally is something like 13%. 13%. Almost insignificant. Everyone else is disengaged or actively I think about a quarter of the global workforce is actively disengaged. And even worse, those numbers have been pretty static for years. And even worse is we all know what the numbers are. And when we share those numbers at leadership conferences, etc., very senior people, they all know, they all nod, and they don't do anything about it. There's this resigned ennui about employee engagement. People don't care enough. This is probably the big problem. Leaders know it, but they, for some reason, don't care enough that their employees are disengaged. And that is not just tragic, it's irresponsible. So leaders have to start getting angry about these results, saying this is unacceptable. Because if you look at major social change anywhere in the world in any different aspect, the thing that finally triggers the change is sufficient numbers of people or sufficient numbers of people of influence saying, this can no longer stand. We have to do something different. Then the conversation changes, action changes, policies change, culture changes, or what.
In creativity in organizations, there is a perception in organizations where the R&D or the research and development or the innovation team are responsible with creativity, or you may have some leaders say, oh, we are not a creative industry. What is your response to that?
Every company and every industry has to care about innovation and creativity. If any organization says our future, running indefinitely into the future, is solely going to be an extrapolation of the past, we just have to keep doing what we're doing, they are leading and engineering their own demise. Because every industry, every company, every market evolves. And you bring up a great point that one of the worst things a company can do is say, oh, we don't have to be creative. We've hired a chief creative officer, or we have an R&D department, or we have, et cetera, right? Then you abrogate all responsibility, and that person or small number of people hidden away in that little cubby hole in the corner of the building, they will be creative, and everyone else can just keep doing what they're doing. Thank you very much. You want everyone in the organization to be curious and dissatisfied with how we do things, looking for the next trend, the next opportunity, the next product, the next service, the next way in which we could do something better internally, the next technology that we should be adopting or experimenting with. If we don't do that, then we're putting a greater creative burden on a smaller and smaller percentage of people in our company, which actually increases the risk of our ability to properly compete in the future. Organizations that don't get their head up and convince everyone to look around, scan the horizon, tell me what we're doing that's good and bad, are missing out on the collective wisdom that they often purport that they defend and grow.
Is there any favorite case you may share around where there was a creative shift, improving the hard business performance around maybe cycle time or margin or retention, or maybe an example of such burst of creativity in the decision making or scaling of an organization?
I wrote a book on creativity and innovation called Sparking Success. And I tried to do two things in that book: to observe and interview highly successful leaders in creative arts organizations, because, of course, creativity is their lifeblood. So I want to see what they do. Then I try to look at what habits do those leaders practice that you can extrapolate and use in any industry, in any function, that is not idiosyncratic to arts organizations. Then I tried to find companies that were not in the arts, that also where their leaders were practicing those behaviors or habits of ways of working or ways of speaking or ways of holding meetings, to demonstrate, as you say, that it can create commercial success, increased retention and engagement, greater discretionary effort from their people, etc. And I saw lots of examples actually in companies that are not in sort of so-called arts organizations, from pharmaceuticals to technology, to you name it. So, for example, the drinks company Diageo, in order to sort of break up, the routinization of their people, once did something really interesting where they hired actors to come into the office and help create different conversations, to spark different conversations. But no one knew that they were actors, right? So they were acting like the janitor or what have you. And it was for short amounts of time. But basically what they're trying to do is kind of shake things up, right? Create a new perspective. Why don't we think about blah, blah, blah? Panasonic and Roche, the technology companies, have done similar things. In one case, they brought in artists who worked with the R&D teams. But in much more prosaic ways, I found leaders just having different conversations. In other words, saying, for example, let's brainstorm, but not judge any of the ideas that we hear. Let's just get all the ideas out, and let's do kind of a, just list every possibility we can think of. Then let's evaluate, which of those ideas might have momentum. That's a very common technique that I see in creative arts organizations. But and with creatively unsuccessful companies, they judge an idea almost sooner than it finishes coming out of someone's mouth. And of course, what you do there, then you've killed the initiative and the ego and the creativity of that person. What are the chances they're ever going to suggest something new or innovative ever again? Chances are they won't. And then the leaders lament, oh, I don't have creative people in my team. No, you've killed the creativity in your team because you don't incentivize it and you don't have the right conversations to help it to thrive.
You've mentioned about the ideas that may be killed too early. But how about the extreme of, I was listening to a Jeff Bezos recent interview where he was talking about, he was giving a feedback early on that he was having too many ideas that the team were not ready for it. So he wasn't releasing the ideas at a rate which was enough for the team to be able to capture it. So he had to learn how to hold back. So how are those practical challenges in terms of managing ideas within that creativity space?
Well, the interesting thing is leaders don't necessarily have to contain or control every new initiative if you lower the cost, scope, scale, and effort of those creative ideas. So one thing that Amazon is incredibly good at is experimentation, encouraging and giving agency to their people to run small, low cost, low effort, low time experiments to see if something is true or if there's a market need or how people would respond to a given new initiative or product or what have you. In fact, but the CEOs of both Amazon and Google have kind of said the same thing when they're frequently asked at conferences, like, what's your secret sauce? What's the secret to your success? And they both said some variation of, we experiment more than anyone else. We need more at-bats or more shots on goal than anyone else. And that's why we're successful. That's why we're innovative, which of course implies not all those ideas work, but it's a numbers game. But the point is that's not waste. You're not throwing lots of money and time away if the experiments are controlled. And the important thing is not that the experiment works or not. The important thing is, what did you learn from it? Then your experiments continue to refine and refine and refine, which means more and more of them have a greater chance of success. It's companies that have a complete rejection of the concept of trying something and not working means they never experiment, which means they never have a capacity for creativity.
What's the difference between strategic innovation and management innovation, and why do most companies over-index on the former?
Well, so management innovation is managing around just that, how we manage and lead our companies. So it's thinking about creating innovations around processes, incentives, hiring, culture, leadership behaviors, experimentation, how we think about diversity and inclusion, et cetera, right? All the acts of leadership. is management innovation, and something we don't think about enough at all in most organizations. Strategic innovation is, again, as it sounds, it's innovating around your business model. And the simplest way that I can explain it is to say that, if I maybe oversimplify a little bit, your strategy answers three questions. Who is my customer? What am I offering them? And how am I offering it? That's effectively that's what your strategy is. And strategic innovation is questioning the assumptions implicit in your answers to those three questions and saying, well, what if any of those assumptions weren't true? How would I change the answer to those questions? And then you might start evolving and changing your strategy, therefore, i.e., innovating your strategy. Now, both management innovation and strategic innovation are very important, and they both can create inimitable competitive advantages, because it's very difficult for competitors to evolve or copy strategy and management culture and style. So even if, a company evolves its strategy or its management methodologies, but then goes, oh, but our competitors can do that. Yes, they can do that, but it would probably take them years or even decades. And by then you've moved on as well. So you're always staying ahead of them. So one is not better than the other when we talk about management innovation and strategic innovation. Both need to be practiced. Both need to be core leadership competencies for leaders in any industry.
Last question before we get your final thought. We talked about the experimentation, which the various successful companies do, but what is your go-to method for testing a strategic bet fast within weeks? So it's not quarters. You talked about experimentation. Am I right in thinking it means that when you experiment, you need to know as quick as possible whether this is going to work without taking months to know it's going to work? So what is your
Yes,
go-to
that's
method?
right.
Yeah.
So, and it will vary depending on the nature of what the experiment is. But as I said before, is make sure it's time bound. So make sure you create the parameters. Like I will know I will have the results in a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month. Ideally, no more than a month is generally my kind of go-to time frame for an experiment. But a week, even better. It's just that in some cases you can't get information in a week, depending on the nature of the experiment. Low or no cost, low or no numbers of permissions required. Because that's actually one of the biggest reasons that people tell me they don't experiment. Well, I need 8 people to give me permission to do ABC. Well, then that's probably not an experiment. You're probably thinking of something much more ambitious, much bigger. That's a project. That's an initiative. Run experiments that are within your sphere of influence and authority. Because again, it's about improving your learning so that you can then create projects and initiatives with fewer unknowns. Therefore, you have increased confidence they will work. Therefore, you are de-risking your innovations in the organization. So that's it. Just low, no cost, very low, short amounts of time, low effort. Because often people, I don't have enough time or energy in the day. So low effort and no permissions required, or at most one other person has to sort of say, yeah, go for it.
You have organizations that allow 10 or 20% of your time to do this
Yeah.
experimentation work, which would then solve that permission challenge.
Yes.
Perhaps it's an organization, so it's
That's right.
behind.
And actually, what you've just given is a great example, going back to your earlier question, of management innovation. It is a management innovation to say, let's give our employees 1 day a week to work on answering curious questions. That might, in the long term, help us serve greater needs, do things better or faster or cheaper, etc. So that's just creating, you're not saying you're not, as a leader, managing the outputs of your creative production. What you're doing is creating the structure within which your people can do that creation. That's a management innovation.
Wow, that's so good. Adam, yeah, this is such a fascinating conversation around sustainability, but we're learning innovation and those culture and structure, as you just mentioned later. So, what is your final thought for the sustainability leader or the startup business working within the sustainability space, or a business which has sustainable products and services? What's your final thought, please?
Just remember that in 99.9% of cases, your company's success is going to be related to the human beings who are in that organization. So leaders do have to be human-centric in their approach. Technology is a wonderful enabler, accelerator, etc. But these technologies still only work by humans and are for humans. So let's not forget that. And let's pay a lot more attention as leaders to creating human dynamics that help make our work life more rewarding and therefore make our companies more dynamic and successful.
Huge thank you, Adam, for your time, these incredible insights. If listeners want to find more about your work and your books, can you let us know where we can find more of your work and
Yeah.
your books?
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly happy for people to connect with me on LinkedIn. I have a website which has lots of my media on it, and it's simply my name. So it's www.adamkingl, ADAMKINGL.com. And I've written 3 books: Next Generation Leadership, which is about this generational piece we've been discussing; Sparking Success, which I mentioned, which is about creativity and innovation. And I have a book coming out next year, June 2026, called Executive Eats, which is about wellness, nutrition, and performance for leaders.
Please consider sharing this episode with a friend or a colleague who would enjoy this conversation that we've just had. So thank you, listeners, and thank you, Adam, once again.
Thank you.